Okay, tonight we're going to look at religions being fundamentally alike. The big question number one is kind of phrased this way. It's a statement that says religions are fundamentally alike, period. And the real question here is, does the material in the chapter support or undermine this idea? It's a pretty good one, and you can make a case in either direction. Just as we've discussed here in class, there are ways that you can prove a thesis or an answer to a prompt in either direction, and all you have to do is just provide the best evidence for it. And let's take you through some of the evidence. So first, religion's a pretty sensitive subject. It's the kind of thing they tell you not to bring up at parties, that and politics, and yet in social studies in general and in world history specifically, we are going to bring those things up. And it's a point of tension between believers and historians too, because historians have to kind of look at the facts and kind of separate out personal belief, because you can't personally believe in every single religion. I would think that'd be difficult, and make a case for each. I would think there'd be some bias involved sometimes. So trying to remove yourself from the pretty slippery spot of trying to prove things religiously, especially that are points of faith. So there's the point of tension of change. So religions present themselves as being a timeless thing, but historians see the development over time and the development of religious ideas over time, and that's a human phenomenon. So again, there's a little spot there that makes it difficult for historians to make sure they have straight. There's experience of a divine reality. This puts historians in some trouble, because now they have to deal with believers' experiential claims. And much of it's based on, even if you look at the mythology stories or creation stories that begin any religious idea, many of them were founded in a time period before an understanding of much of the world of science. And, there's some that you can explain and understand, and there's also this tricky spot of faith, because you may believe the word of the Bible, or the what's in the Torah, or the Old Testament, or the Quran, the book of the Analects. It could be any religious text, and you could feel so strongly about it that you believe absolutely in every word that's in there is correct, or you could believe potentially that there's stories to help people understand how to behave and how to live through life. So historians look at this and try to separate out the personal feelings, but which within each religion there are many groups. Like Buddhism will talk about Mahayana and Theravada. Christianity, there are divisions between Protestants and Catholics, and there are divisions within those divisions. Things can get pretty dicey, and sometimes there's a point of emphasis that they're choosing for their religion that goes in a fundamentally different way than the other side, but they're still both Christian or Buddhist. So, and it's difficult to reconcile personal belief with historical scholarship, and this becomes very difficult for some people, and it just depends on how you feel about the matter. But I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that you can't just completely throw it out and say it's too tough a topic to discuss, and it's, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings here, and that's not really what we're trying to do. But classical religions and religious technologies and religious traditions, are enormously important in world history, and you're going to see that throughout this chapter and throughout the first semester. But it also leads into what we study in the second semester. So just keep in mind there are some religious reasons behind what goes on and what happens in world history. So are religions fundamentally alike? The three images, and I should point out 4 images across the bottom of the screen, are each showing founders of a faith or a religious god. in some cases. Can you pick who each one of those persons are? Let's talk through them here and see if you can figure this out. In support of the idea that religions are fundamentally alike, you could say that there are influences like that of Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which they're alike because many of them come from a same common background. Each of these types of religions, and Islam we'll get to a lot later, it's why it's kind of dark gray there. It's not really in this chapter. It doesn't develop until later. That's the best example here because it's apparent just in history that it didn't develop as an official religion, although I will make the case and understand that some of my Islamic students in the past have said, Mr. Duez, I want to disagree with you on that point because we just believe as good Muslims that, and some do, that each of the persons on the screen were just really early Muslim leaders. They just didn't know that they were, or it was misinterpreted. And that's their right to believe that. But you can see where each of these religions are kind of flowing through. Zoroastrianism, there's some argument there. Is it the first monotheistic religion? There's some evidence of that, but there are evidence of multiple gods in some way. But some of the same story elements of what's going to happen in the world, and we'll look at some of these here in a second, are very similar to what ends up happening with Judaism, what ends up happening with the development of Christianity then, and of course with Islam. So who are the founders or gods of these religions at the bottom? There are 4 of them. I think that the photo on the left is of Zoroaster, and Zoroaster is the founder of Zoroastrianism. Pretty simple. The god Ahura Mazda. This is an early Persian religion. We'll talk about it in a second. The second person there is of Abraham, and the Abrahamic religions there of Judaism, Christianity. Jesus was a Jew who had some of his own ideas, and then a religion was created around him. And at the bottom right corner is the word, I believe this is correct, the word written in Arabic or in the Arabic script for their idea of what God is. There are some Islamic sects or segments who believe you should not ever kind of show Muhammad or Allah, the God of their belief, because that's God's job to create the human form, and you shouldn't be painting or creating that. Excuse me. So, at the bottom here, some more pictures to help maybe focus you in here. In support of the thesis that religions are fundamentally alike, you could point to the influence of Judaism on Christianity and then on Islam. And a good central point of emphasis here could be the Hagia Sophia, which is in Istanbul, Turkey. Well, at least it is now. It's currently a museum/mosque, and I think there are some religious services that occur there, but mostly a museum, historical spot. It's formerly an imperial mosque, and you can see the date there. 1453 is the fall of Constantinople, as we'll discuss here in a little while. It was also the Roman Catholic cathedral, and originally constructed as an Eastern Orthodox cathedral. So this is a great example, this one building, of the influences of these religions and how they share some things in common. So much so that they could have a building that was used to, house the worship of both of these faiths, Christianity and Islam. Well, more on that in a second, but a couple things about the pictures that you see. The idea of a heaven and a hell and a judgment day. These are ideas that originally we see quite a lot in Zoroastrianism, and then later with Judaism some, and with Christianity certainly. The image in the middle there of the man holding the boy down, that's Abraham, being told by the angels of God to kill his son, but then also saying, no, stop, after they knew he would do it. And it was a way to, in the story, a way to test Abraham's faith in God. So, flip the page here. We'll show you a map in a second, but let's look at moving towards monotheism first. So the search for a God in the Middle East. This is this radical notion, and at the time period it really is a radical notion of a single supreme deity, one God. And before this, we know we've looked at the folks in Mesopotamia, early civilization, and the river valley civilization of Egypt as well. Many gods, multiple gods, a polytheist approach. We've also seen that in Greece. But here in the Middle East, there's this movement towards monotheism. So Zoroastrianism does develop this idea of maybe one god or deity, supreme deity anyway, and then Judaism. So became the basis, this idea, for Christianity and Islam as well. Let's look at Zoroastrianism in some detail here a little bit. The Persian prophet Zarathustra, traditionally dated 6th or 7th century BCE, the state support has state support during the Persian Achaemenid dynasty. Sorry, it's late. But this single idea of a single god, Ahura Mazda, a source of truth and light and goodness in the world, and that's a similar idea that you hear in some other religions. A few ideas kind of wrap your head around here with Zoroastrianism. There's a cosmic struggle between the forces of good and evil. There's Ahura Mazda, the god who will eventually win, aided by a final savior. There's this idea of a judgment day or restoration of the world to purity and peace, and a need for the individual to choose, kind of which side they're going to be on. Are you going to be good or are you going to be evil? And it's pretty much a cut and dry black and white thing. Belief in the final defeat of evil with the help of a Messiah or Savior, and the remaking of the world at the end of time. These are all ideas that are kind of similar with Christianity for certain, and you may be familiar with them. But Zoroastrianism did not spread widely beyond the Persian Empire. There are small pockets of it in India today. I think they call that the Parsian, which is kind of short for Persians, but it's a very, very small number of people today. And why? Mostly because Alexander the Great's empire, and after that you have the arrival of Islam as well. So that kind of pushes Zoroastrianism to the side, and it does not develop. Another reason, if you think about it, we'll go flip back here, is the Persian Empire's approach towards those that they conquered, and their approach towards ruling was to let the people that they conquered, keep their cultural ideas, and they didn't force them down the road of their own personal beliefs. It had state backing, but it wasn't an official religion that they would force people to choose, if you catch my drift there. So Judaism develops among the Hebrews recorded in the Old Testament. It's the early tradition of migration to Palestine led by Abraham, who we showed you earlier. The early tradition of enslavement in Egypt and the escape, and then the establishment of a state in Israel. It's about 1000 BCE. Give you an idea of a timeline here. But Judean exiles in Babylon retain their cultural identity, and they return to their homeland. They have a distinctive idea of God, Yahweh, who demands exclusive loyalty, a relationship with Yahweh as a covenant or contract, which is very important because it's showing that they're a specialized group in the eyes of their God. It's lofty, transcendental deity which you could communicate with. So these ideas are real important. So these are the foundations for both Christianity and Islam, which kind of flow from this one religion. So I wanted to show you Istanbul, which is right here in the middle of this strait here. It sits here, and another way of looking at it is to see, okay, here's the Greek islands, Turkey, which was the Persian Empire as it went down into Persia. Rome is here, where the Roman Empire would be. So where is Istanbul? It's right there. Today, Istanbul is yesterday's Constantinople and yesterday's Byzantium. meaning that it was first the city of Byzantium, which was the center of the Byzantine Empire. Then it became Constantinople when the Roman Emperor Constantine, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, basically takes a stick and goes around this territory and marks off and says, "This is where I want my city walls to be," and takes what was like a dusty outpost and turns it into this magnificent city. And then it was later conquered, and we'll get there in 1453. We're a little ways off of that just yet, by the Islamic Turks, and they retain control of Istanbul for quite a while. But this is that pivot point we've mentioned before between where East meets West. It's important to consider that this may be in some ways a dividing line for Eastern thought in some ways and Western thought. Although, I don't know how perfect that is, but it gives you an idea maybe to think about like the differences between Europe and the Western philosophies and maybe the more Eastern philosophies that we see. But religions are fundamentally alike. Let's get back to our statement here. And students could point out, if you're trying to answer this point and try to take a side, that there are some similarities across traditions, especially Buddhism, and Christianity is highlighted in the chapter. So you see at the bottom the red and the green movement of these two religions. Let's look at it a little closer here. So the 5 centuries after the birth of Jesus, Christianity found converts from Spain all the way northeast into Africa, Central Asia, and India. The Roman Empire, Aksum, who we will discuss a little bit here later on, Armenia, which Armenians are up here in Egypt, in Europe, and this new religion enjoyed state support with the Roman Empire as well. Subsequently, Christianity took root pretty solidly in Europe post 1000 CE in Russia as well. So it kind of spreads from Constantinople. This red arrow here is really super important. We'll get to it later. But you have what they call the first Rome, of course, which was Rome, and the second Rome, which Constantine calls Constantinople, this new Rome. And then when the Turks settle here and they knock the city walls down and they take over Constantinople, create what's today Istanbul, the religion that forms the basis for the cultural identity of early Russia comes from that Eastern Orthodox background of Christianity. So it's also important to understand in the Christian world, you've got the Roman Catholic Church. With the fall of Rome, and it weakens the Italian peninsula, you've got much of the wealth and ability of that Roman Empire to continue in the eastern side of it, and the western side's kind of slowing down some and being taken over by some invaders. We'll call them barbarians in class. We'll discuss whether that is a correct notion or not. In the east, over here in India, you've got the origins and beginnings of Buddhism, but you can see it spread north across the Himalayas and then into China. You can see it spread over here into Korea and then spread into Southeast Asia. And these are important factors to consider as we go through here. One of the ways that it spreads, of course, is through trade. So let's look at the lives of the founders of these two religions. Gautama, you see him on the right there, or as the Buddha then, was a royal. He was someone who was very wealthy, very rich, but Jesus was from a lower class family. So there's some differences within the founders there. Both, though, become spiritual seekers. Both were mystics and claimed to have personal experiences with another level of reality. Based on life's work and their religious experiences, they are able to create a great following. Both were wisdom teachers. And that means they challenged conventional values, urged renunciation of wealth, and they stressed love and compassion as the basis for morality. And they called for personal transformation or a change within their followers. This is very important when you're looking at both of these religions. So comparing them both as founders, Jesus had a Jewish tradition of a single personal deity in his background and his family and the way he was raised. Jesus' teaching was more social and political than Gautama's. So that's important to remember, especially when you're considering the time period that Jesus was alive. Jesus was active for about 3 years, which is not very much time, but it's amazing how much momentum was gained by those 3 years. And Gautama for over 40 years. Jesus was executed as a criminal, of course, but Gautama died of old age, so he lived a long life. Comparing Jesus and the Buddha a little more, you're looking at established new religions. They were establishing a new religious way, and probably neither really wanted to do that and create a new religion, but they both end up ideally doing that. The followers transformed both of them into gods, and Buddha was one who didn't really think that that was necessary originally, but then as the religion spreads into China to give it more of a practical purpose, some believe Theravada Buddhism became Mahayana Buddhism, and there was more of an emphasis on the god that they could worship of Buddha. But how Christianity became a world religion is an interesting process. We've already looked at the story of Paul in class. Women have tremendously more opportunities with Christianity because of this idea that all people are equal and free to come to God and worship, and they should be treated that way. But there's still the patriarchy of the time is definitely reflected. You can read that in the Bible as well. Women as being owned by men and as property in that way. But early converts were typically urban, lower class, and women. So I think that's part of the power of Christianity, because women who were raising families in these civilizations, in these cities, and in the Roman Empire, of course, they're passing these religious ideals on to their kids, and it's growing there as well. So it's more of a family religion, and it's not going to be a situation with the Jews where it's just a segment of the population who might be eligible to become a follower of the religion. So the miracle stories were an attraction, of course, and the idea of Christian compassion and care for others. Let's look at the, first of all, Roman persecution of Christians as atheists. We discussed Perpetua in class as a good example of that. But before her, there was Paul, as we mentioned earlier, who was killed for his beliefs and his teachings about Jesus also. Roman persecution of Christians as atheists, because they were non-believers in their gods, and they believed in just one God. This ended with the conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, who we've also discussed in class, but it's a pretty interesting story, and in a lot of ways Constantine wasn't the best Christian ever, but he sure used it in a way that was powerful, because a lot of his troops were Christian, his wife was, and his conversion to Christianity came at kind of an ideal time for him, as he was faced with pretty difficult odds to beat Maxentius at what's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. He sees a sign in the sky, and some of his people mention that that's a sign from the true God, the one God. And although this picture at the top's not actually accurate, you see the big cross in the sky, but the symbol is actually more like a chiro, as we showed you in another video. But that was more accurate for the Latin of the day. But for us to understand it, that's basically what he was seeing in the sky as a representation of Christ, or at least he took that on. It's really interesting, too, to consider that he is then leading Christians who wouldn't want to necessarily be soldiers any longer because of the peaceful nature of Christianity. Yet he was able to capture, because he becomes Christian, he's able to capture that essence of still defending and fighting for Rome, but also fighting for that one God, or in his case, one ruler, because he had a situation where he was a part of a divvying up of the Roman Empire. This gave him the opportunity to be that one ruler, one emperor. And I think that that's one of the reasons why he probably felt that it was a good thing to do. I mean, was he a great Christian? That's debatable for some of the things that he did. But he definitely was important in the realm of Christianity becoming popular amongst the Roman people and among Europeans. Theodosius becomes the first who orders all the closures of polytheistic temples and makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. It spreads throughout Europe and parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Buddhism has Ashoka's support in India, but it's never really promoted as their sole religion, and it does die out here after a little while. Not die out as much, but it doesn't spread within India and it doesn't take over the Hinduistic cultural traditions that they have, but it does spread into China and takes off quite a bit, and then the rest of Southeast Asia as well. Christianity developed a male hierarchy organization to replace the early house churches. Women were excluded from priesthood. There was concern for uniform doctrine and practice, the emergence of a bishop of Rome, the Pope, as the leader of the Western Europe, and then later you'll see that Constantinople is run by a single ruler who is also the Pope. We call that Caesar Pope, or we'll get more into it. I think it's going to be in the chapter on Christianity in Europe that comes up here in a little bit, but a Caesar Pope kind of person. So there are some doctrinal controversies, of course, and a split in the church from east and west. And we'll get into that in another chapter, but it's interesting to consider here. But Buddhism clashed over interpretations of Buddha's teachings, and you'll see that's where you develop this idea of Buddha being a god and the separation of Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. But there's less a right and a wrong than with Christian conflicts, and maybe it's a little less warlike because of the basic nature of Buddhism and how Christianity developed in some ways with the Roman Empire as more of a Christian soldier type approach. But Buddhism did not develop an overall church hierarchy at all. It's more like the monks and the oral tradition that was passed on from them. So you could also look at our statement that you're trying to say, whether it's true or not, to emphasize some differences. And mostly what we've been studying so far as we're looking at this is all similarities. It's a few subtle differences, but mostly similar. You can emphasize differences where you could point to within cultural traditions, like in India, that there are some real differences that separate Hindu and Buddhist faiths. They both agree that a single force governs the universe, a force, maybe not as much of a god, but a force. They believe in a reincarnation and that humans can merge with a universal force that runs the galaxy, the world, the universe. Hinduism believes in karma and dharma, yoga, and many gods, these ideas. Buddhism, on the other hand, is more focused on a right way of living, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and that all people could achieve nirvana, which that's very different than in Hinduism with the idea of reincarnation, but that you're going to move up in class to get there. So again, religions are fundamentally alike. You could point to differences across cultural traditions, such as the difference between the conception of God even in the Jewish and Christian traditions, in the Brahmin and in the Indian tradition, Brahmin or Hinduist or Hindu religion, or the Tao conception of it in the Chinese tradition, so Taoism. And just looking at the different ideas of how they conceive God and who that is and what that means. There are some who believe, and we'll touch on this in a later video, that the Hindu faith is really a singular God among all of those forces, is really one, and it's similar to the Christian idea of the Trinity, if that helps you kind of wrap your head around that. We'll talk more about that as we go. So the other thing to consider here is just that students could also note that there's a difference between Greek and Confucian philosophy, and that traditions that focus on the supernatural, they kind of take that out of the equation for the most part. It's more based upon a philosophy, way of living, or way of looking at the world in different ways. So that's a little bit different than religions, and you might not even get into that if you're answering this question in that way. But during this time period, they were philosophical ideas developed then, and these cultural traditions, which they definitely were, is sort of where you would focus in on that if you were choosing to even mention it in this question. So again, this is the big picture question number one: were religions fundamentally alike? And I think you can kind of go in either direction, but you've seen there's some real similarities. Most students make the mistake on this kind of question where they're going to try to be like very general, and I challenge you to be as specific as possible when you're answering these types of questions, especially with the AP test. Dig down deep and mention the particulars here, not just overarching like themes, but be specific, and hopefully that'll help you if you have a question to answer like this in the AP test. Till next time, we'll see you later. Don't forget to be awesome.